Hello，你好，Welcome back，欢迎回来to Wisdom Wednesday with Johnny Tiger. The date is September 7, 2022. Today for lunch, Kitten and I and a couple of our really good friends went out for some Korean barbecue, and that kind of inspired me to talk a little bit about some of the ins and outs of Chinese barbecue. And don't worry, I'm not going to sit here and claim that Korean barbecue came from China. I mean, maybe it did, but I actually don't know that. Uh, I will let you know that my father, when he was very young, about 20 years old, became the owner or the co-owner of the first Korean barbecue restaurant in the city of Kaohsiung in Taiwan. Kaohsiung is a city that I grew up in, and my family took its root. The story that was told to me was that my father, when he was a teenager, he went up to northern China, went to Taipei, and tried to, uh, do the teenager thing, live on his own, and make his own way in the world. And he waited tables in a Korean barbecue restaurant. And the few times that he got a chance to try Korean barbecue, it was so amazing that he fell in love with it. And so ever since then, he uh, paid close attention to the chef and what they were doing, how they marinated the meat, how they cut the meat, what kind of meat they would buy, and so on and so on. And finally, when he decided that he'd learned enough, he went back to the city of Kaohsiung, which was southern Taiwan, and because he was young and he didn't have savings of his own, but his sister was already quite rich at the time. So she contributed the money and her expertise in management, and my father contributed the recipes for the marinating the meat, and they together opened the first Korean barbecue restaurant in the city of Kaohsiung. Of course, pretty soon my father got bored with just owning a restaurant and moved on to other things. So the restaurant fell to my auntie to manage and uh, keep running. I wish, I bet my dad wished he would have held on to the restaurant because he's 80 years old now, he still loves Korean barbecue. And I bet he simply wishes that he still owns his own Korean barbecue restaurant where he can get free meals whenever he likes. But anyway, enough about Korean barbecue. Let's talk about Chinese barbecue. When we talk about Chinese barbecue, we're going to talk about it in several different sections. But first, little bit of Mandarin lesson. Barbecue in Mandarin is called 烤肉, Kow, 肉, uh, R O R O W. But you don't say roll, you say 肉. You can't do that tongue against the roof of your mouth saying 肉, 烤肉. 肉 means meat. Okay, so uh, uh, beef would be 牛肉. Uh, 牛 means cattle, cow, ox. Uh, pork would be 猪肉, Juro, Row, Juro. means pig. Chicken would be 鸡肉, Jerow. G means chicken. Uh, lamb would be 羊肉. That's Youngrow. 羊肉. Duck would be 鸭肉. That's Yearow. 鸭肉. I mean, we can go on and on, but let's not get weird about it. Uh, let's just keep at some of the more commonly seen stuff. Of course, there's a 鱼肉, that's Yourow, that means fish. So 烤肉 means barbecue, barbecue meat. So let's look at first on the historical record of Chinese barbecue. Uh, how far back does it go? Well, unofficially, there has been uh, literatures, books, parchments that shows the Chinese people were doing barbecues about 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But the truly enlightening piece of historical proof came in the form of a stone plaque that was unearthed in the Xizhou region of China in 1986. In 1986, in Xizhou province, they dug out of the earth this big stone plaque. Upon being dated by archaeologists, the plaque is said to be at least 1,900 years old, maybe 2,000 years old. And on this plaque is a very telling uh, depiction. There's this artwork on this plaque of a bunch of men standing around a giant bonfire with a fan in one hand, fanning the fire, and in the other hand, they had long sticks with pieces of meat on it, roasting in the fire. So that's our most concrete official proof to this day that at least around 2,000 years ago, Chinese people were having a good time enjoying barbecue. Now let's talk about preparation because in Chinese barbecue, for at least the past uh, 300 years, it has been pretty consistent. It has not changed much. Uh, if you want to do a proper Chinese barbecue, which means northern Chinese barbecue, okay, no matter what they call it, all the Chinese barbecue come from the northern region. But we are going to get to that in little while. But first, let's talk about preparation. Unlike Japanese people with their teriyaki sauce, unlike Korean people with their marinading, and unlike a lot of the other uh, countries that pre-marinate their meat, Chinese barbecue, when you want to do it properly, you don't marinate the meat. The meat have to be tender and soft enough that it doesn't require marinade, which means you got to pick the best of the best. The meat that you pick cannot be any old steak, cannot be any old roast. The meat picked for barbecuing in Chinese or northern Chinese barbecue have to be the best cut, the best top cut of meat, so tender that it doesn't require marinade. When you cook this meat, you barbecue it usually on sticks, or some people just do it. They make the slices of meat really big, and then they uh, just do it on chopsticks. They hold it with their chopstick over the fire, and then they flip it, and keep flipping it while it's barbecuing. Now, what you do is when the meat is half cooked, you take it off the fire, you throw on the condiment, you throw on the seasoning. We'll talk about that in another section as well, what seasoning, what required. You put the seasoning on when the meat is half cooked, throw it back on the fire, and then the last step is uh, crushed chili pepper or hot sauce. So hot sauce or chili pepper It does not go in the seasoning, does not go in the marinade. That is the last item. Before you put the meat on someone's plate and offer it to them, you ask them, "Do you like spicy food?" If they say yes, you give them some ground chili pepper on the meat. And if they say no, you just give them the meat without the chili pepper. So you do not put the chili pepper in the seasoning, or you do not marinate the meat. Of course, if you are not barbecuing, if you are doing stew, if you are doing deep frying, if you are doing broil, char broil, any other preparation, then go ahead, marinate your meat however you like. But uh, true and proper Chinese barbecue, the meat cannot be marinated. It has to be the best of the best meat and seasoned as you are cooking it. Nowadays, most of the time when you hear people talk about it, they enjoy Chinese barbecue, they are looking for a very specific kind of meat. They are looking for lamb. Uh, but traditionally, lamb was not the prime choice. Traditionally, uh, rich people would have beef. Poor people would either have horse or pork. Now let's look at one interesting little etiquette um, when it comes to barbecue. When you go to China and Taiwan nowadays, because there's barbecue vendors, barbecue restaurants, barbecue storefront everywhere, so you'll see this very often. You'll see mostly young people uh, walking around on the street, shopping, getting things done, and they have a bag, big paper bag in one hand, and there would be these skewers, uh, sticks sticking out of the top of the bag, and they would randomly pull these out, and these would have barbecue meat on it, and they would munch as they go on their business. A lot of people walk and eat, drive and eat, ride their bicycle and eat their barbecue. So nowadays, modern Chinese barbecue is almost like their version of fast food. However, this has only been this way for less than 100 years. Prior to 1920, prior to 1920, if you were to walk around on the street and eating, you would bring shame to your family because this was a big taboo, big no-no. Chinese people took their ceremonies very seriously, especially around money and food. And this was one of those big no-nos in Chinese culture. Even if it's barbecue, you could not walk and eat, or drive and eat, or ride a horse and eat at the same time. You need to find somewhere to sit down at the table, or at least sit on the ground somewhere and have a proper sit down and eat. To walk and eat would announce to the world that you were either a hoodlum who had no culture, no education, or you would be telling people that you were a beggar because back then only homeless people and beggar walk around and eat at the same time. So as I mentioned, when we say Chinese barbecue, it really is primarily northern Chinese barbecue. Mongolian, Xinjiang, Tibet, uh, it's all northern barbecue. There's no barbecue tradition that comes from the south or middle or the east China. It's all came from the north. The reason being, barbecuing was primarily the cooking method of what Chinese people refer to as the barbarians, the Manchus, the Mongolian, the Mongols, sorry, uh, Mongols, Manchus, and other tribes outside the Great Wall back in the imperial time. Chinese people primarily like soup, especially back in the old days. They like stew, they like soup, they like something that you put on the fire and you can keep adding ingredient to it every day, and it will last a long time. You can serve it over rice and make the rice uh, wet and soupy and go down easy like that, and keep you really warm in the winter time, something like that. Chinese people loved wet food like a soup and stew, at the very least, stir fry with sauce on it. This whole barbecue thing didn't originate in China. It came from north of China, from the tribal people, the nomads that travel around with their livestock and their tent and their women and their children all the time. They do not stay put. Now, why is it that they specialized in barbecue? There were two schools of thought. One school of thought, this was probably the more accurate one, is because when you're traveling all the time, you have to be ready to move at an instant notice. So you don't have time to build a big fire, put a pot on it, and wait for that pot to boil for 3 hours or 4 hours to make your stew. Don't forget, there's no pressure cooker or air fryer back then. You wanted to make a pot of stew, you got to do it the honest way. It would take hours to do it. So, the tribesmen from these northern tribes and nomadic people prefer something quick. Uh, so they would do thin slices of meat, a very thin flatbread, very thinly sliced vegetable, and then roast that over a big fire. And this doesn't take long. Take like maybe 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on how well cooked you like your meat. Uh, and then they could eat and get on with their traveling, with their moving and relocating. Uh, there's less time preparing for food, and more time can be spent doing other things like hunting and gathering and finding a suitable water source and campground. So this is one of the school of thought why um, barbecue was the primary cooking method of the northern Chinese. The second one, and I told this one before, but this one it's more, for me, this is a little bit more intriguing and kind of funny, is because the northern uh, tribesmen constantly invaded China. So they constantly came over the Great Wall, raping, pillaging, looting, and then they would go back across the wall. So the Chinese emperor uh, got annoyed and cut their supply. Basically, the Chinese emperor put on a law that no one is allowed to trade with the northerner. No one's allowed to trade with these barbarians. We are no longer going to export uh, our plates and uh, crockeries and pots and stuff like that to them. Well, then again, these people, they were good hunters, they were good gatherers, they were good horsemen and archers. They were not good at making their own pots and pans and stuff like that. Most of their cooking supplies came from China. So when the Chinese emperor did that, it totally ruined their ability to cook a proper meal because they no longer had pots and pans and other necessities like utensils. So, in, uh, in response to that, most of them converted over to just putting pieces of meat on a long stick and cook over an open fire. This way, you don't need pans or pots or any of that nonsense. You can just eat like that. That's second, more unlikely, but definitely much more interesting explanation. Now let's talk about the ingredients. Like we already established that nowadays it's mostly lamb. People who prefer Chinese barbecue, people who like Chinese barbecue, like such as myself, I love Chinese barbecue lamb. The time just is now 5 so tender and amazing. I know there are a lot of people who don't eat lamb. Hey, that's okay. More for me. Uh, so um, when it comes to modern ingredients for Chinese barbecue, there's nothing complicated about it. Salt, cumin, uh, onion, cilantro, and chili pepper. Now, salt has been a staple for barbecue even from way back when. Of course, back 2,000 years ago, salt was a commodity that uh, only rich people could get their hands on. But nowadays, salt is so cheap that it goes without saying that you have salt for no matter what you're cooking. Now, cumin is an interesting one. Cumin actually was largely unknown until 1980 to Chinese people because most people in China didn't really use it for anything. It wasn't until 1980 when Northern barbecue became super, super popular all throughout China that people realized, hey, cumin is pretty good on meat. I love cumin beef and cumin lamb, and so I definitely am glad of that. When did cumin first get introduced to China? Well, actually, it was way back about 1500 years ago during the Tang Dynasty, but it wasn't really used in cooking at that time. Most of it was used as a preservative because they learned it from the Egyptians. Yes, you probably didn't realize this, but Egyptians were the first people that started using cumin, but they did not use it in their food. Instead, cumin was the main ingredient, main preservative they put into the body cavities of those people they wanted to mummify. So if you ever get a chance, I don't know if he will, but if you ever get a chance to get up and close to a real mummy in the museum, you will notice that the mummy smells a lot like cumin because that's what they used as one of the main ingredients in mummification. So, for thousands of years, cumin was mostly used as a preservative. It's not until much later that people started putting it on their meat when they barbecue the meat. The next ingredient that is interesting is chili pepper. Chili pepper uh, did not exist in China for the longest time. Like a lot of people believe that there's so many spicy Chinese food like kung pao chicken, Sichuan fish, and stuff like that. So people believe that chili pepper, in particular black pepper and cracked or ground pepper, it's been used in China for a long time. But no, uh, peppercorn, black pepper, cracked pepper, the kind of pepper you use for seasoning, that did not get introduced to Chinese people until around the Ming Dynasty, so about 400 years ago. Cilantro, almost must have when you want proper, really good tasting Chinese style barbecue. But this ingredient is tricky. Cilantro, you cannot put it in the fire too early because then it will wilt and go soft and lose all its taste. You cannot put it on too late because then it's too fresh and tastes too much like, well, raw cilantro. So when you want to put cilantro on is when your meat is just about done. and you put the cilantro under the meat and quickly flip it a few times, and then you put it in the plate. Right? So you cook it very, very briefly, enough to uh, cook that rawness, that raw vegetable taste out of the cilantro, and then you put it in your plate and start eat it with your meat. Um, Another ingredient that is interesting in Chinese barbecue is the onion. Nowadays, people use like to cheat and they use regular onion or regular green onion. Uh, but if you ever have the fortune of trying the real authentic Chinese barbecue, they are very specific with the onion. It has to be the Chinese goat horn green onion. What is a goat horn green onion? That is not a different kind of green onion, by the way. It's just your regular green onion. But the goat horn green onion is that little bit of green onion at the end of the year that didn't get picked, that get left in the ground and wilt and dry out during the winter time. And when spring come around, that green onion will sprout again and grow new batch of green onion. But this new batch of green onion are very small. They look very crooked, like the horn of a goat. And they are tiny, they're skinny, they're dry looking, they don't look very appetizing. These are what we call the goat horn green onion. These are the uh, true, proper onion ingredient for Chinese barbecue because these onion, even though they are very small, very skinny, very ugly, very dry looking, they are super, super strong. They pack a punch. Like most of the time when you cut green onion, your eyes won't tear up. But if you cut these goat horn green onion, you will tear up. It's almost like cutting a real regular onion. That's how strong they are. Um, and also the reason that these would preferred over regular green onion or even onion is these things are very dry. So they will help soak up the grease that come from the meat, and they won't get the meat really wet. Not like when you use regular green onion or onion, they are juicy. They're really juicy, so they will tend to make your meat a little bit drippy and ruin the texture of the meat a little bit. Now, here is something not for the faint of heart. There was one primary ingredient in Chinese barbecue that I'm glad is no longer being used. You see, nowadays when you do barbecue, you use charcoal, you use electric stove, and all that stuff. But uh, up to about 100 years ago, during the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China, the real proper Chinese barbecue uh, have to be cooked using dried out horse manure. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. I wish I was, but this was how people were so casual about it. Back then, during the Qing Dynasty, if you hear two old friends talking on the street, you would hear something like this sometimes. You'd say, "Hey, haven't seen you for a while. How are you? "Oh, I'm fine. How are you doing?" "I'm great. Hey, the weather is getting better. Why don't you come over to my place? We'll have a good barbecue. We'll have a big barbecue in the yard. We got some nice horse manure this time." And people would actually put that in the conversation. That's how casual this was. Now, obviously, they didn't use fresh horse manure. Like I said, they have to be dried out, treated, uh, turned into like bricks or patties. Uh, the reason being, again, got to go back to the origin of Chinese barbecue. It's a northern tribesman, northern barbarian, uh, uh, northern people, and they were horsemen, horsewomen. They were nomads. They didn't have time to go dig for charcoal or cut wood, cut down trees. I mean, it's all grassland out there. There wasn't a lot of trees to begin with. What was the most available thing they had that could be used to burn as fuel was horse and cattle manure. Now, it was said that cattle manure gave a kind of a worse smell than horse manure. So they use cattle manure to burn for warmth and for to warm their tents, to warm their bed, and horse manure were used for cooking. In fact, in back in the old days in China, if you do a barbecue and you use charcoal or wood as fuel, that's telling everybody that you were poor. You couldn't afford horses. So rich people, noblemen, royalties, they made sure the whole world knew that their barbecue was fueled with horse manure because they were rich and powerful and they could afford horses. Yeah, like I said, I'm glad that's no longer a thing. Anyway, I this talk about Chinese barbecue getting me a little bit hungry, so I'm going to call it a day. And I hope you guys enjoy this episode. And if you have a Chinese barbecue nearby, Mongolian grill, something like that, maybe this is a good time to go refresh your memory on how Chinese barbecue tastes. Thank you for checking out today's Wisdom Wednesday. I'll be back again tomorrow for some Toy Thursday. For now, 谢谢 and 再见。